Let me ask you something strange. Have you noticed how some people hate remote work? Not just dislike it, not just prefer the office, but hate it, deeply, viscerally. Like something about it offends them on a level they can't quite explain. They'll tell you it is about collaboration, about company culture, about bumping into colleagues by the water cooler. And maybe part of that is true. But if you look closer, if you really pay attention, there is something else happening underneath, something psychological, something painful, something that has almost nothing to do with productivity at all. Here is what I mean. Think about the generation who built their lives around the office. The ones who woke up at 5 a.m., put on suits, kissed sleeping kids goodbye, and sat in gridlock traffic for 2 hours just to reach a cubicle. The ones who stayed late not because they had work, but because the boss was still there. The ones who believed, truly, deeply believed, that physical presence was the only path to success. They missed dance recitals. They ate dinner behind the wheel. They traded evenings with their children for evenings in conference rooms. And they did it all because they were told, this is what it takes. Now imagine being that person. Imagine spending 30, 40 years believing that, sacrificing for that, building your entire identity around that. And then imagine watching a younger generation roll out of bed at 8:55, open a laptop in sweatpants, and get the same work done in 5 hours, without leaving the house. If remote work is actually more efficient, if you really can be productive from a kitchen table, what does that make those 40 years of sacrifice? If remote work is actually more efficient, it means their suffering was entirely unnecessary. And that is a truth too heavy to carry. That weight. That is what this is really about. Let's rewind for a moment. Before remote work existed as an option, there was a different kind of currency in the workplace. Not output, not results, visibility. You learned this young if you grew up in that era. Being the first to arrive and the last to leave wasn't just noticed, it was rewarded. Walking fast through hallways, with a coffee mug and a stressed expression wasn't a sign of poor time management. It was a badge of honor. Psychologists have a term for this. They call it performative effort. It is when the appearance of working becomes more important than the work itself. And for an entire generation, performative effort wasn't just accepted, it was the entire system. Think about the rituals, the way people would CC managers on emails just to prove they were responding, the way they'd schedule meetings that didn't need to happen, just to fill the calendar, the way they'd sigh loudly at their desks, rub their temples, make sure everyone could see how hard they were grinding. None of this was about getting things done. It was about sending a message: I belong here. I'm one of you. I'm willing to suffer. And suffering was the point. Because in that world, if you weren't visibly suffering, you weren't working hard enough. If you left at 5 p.m. sharp, you were phoning it in. If you took a real lunch break, you lacked drive. If you seemed calm, collected, balanced. If you looked like you had a life outside those walls, people quietly judged you. For them, presence wasn't about productivity. It was about proving you belonged. And belonging meant everything. It meant job security. It meant promotions. It meant being seen as serious about your career. So they played the game for decades. And somewhere along the way, the game stopped feeling like a game. It started feeling like truth. This is what you need to understand. For many boomers, looking busy isn't a behavior they chose. It is a belief system they absorb. It is the air they breathe from their first job to their last. And when you've believed something that deeply for that long, you don't just change your mind because someone shows you data. You feel threatened. Because if that belief was wrong, what else was wrong? Let's get specific for a moment. Because the abstraction matters, but the loss matters more. Think about what actually got traded during those decades. A father sitting in traffic on the 405, gripping the steering wheel, watching the minutes tick by while his daughter's soccer game started without him. A mother rushing through a frozen dinner in the office break room, missing the nightly ritual of reading bedtime stories. A couple too exhausted to talk, too drained to connect, too busy performing effort to remember why they started working in the first place. These aren't small things. These are the moments that make up a life, and the system told them it was necessary. It told them this is the price of success. This is what it means to provide. This is how you show you're responsible. So they paid the price, day after day, year after year. Now, here is where psychology comes in. There is a concept called cognitive dissonance. It is the mental discomfort you feel when two beliefs contradict each other, when reality challenges something you've built your life around. For example, if you believe you're a good driver and you get into a car accident, your brain will look for excuses, bad weather, another driver, anything to protect that belief. Because the alternative may be I'm not as good as I thought. is too painful to accept. Now apply that to work. If you believe your decades of sacrifice were necessary, and someone shows you a world where those sacrifices aren't required, your brain has two options. Option 1, accept that you suffered unnecessarily. That those missed bedtimes, those cold dinners, those years of exhaustion, none of it was needed. That you could have been home, present, alive, and still succeeded. Option 2, reject the new information. Fight it, dismiss it, call it lazy, call it unrealistic. Protect the belief at all costs. Which one do you think the human mind chooses? They didn't just lose time. They lost moments they can never get back, all for a system that told them it had to be this way. This is the brutal truth hiding beneath the surface of every remote work is bad for culture argument. It is not about collaboration. It is not about innovation. It is about protection. Protection of a story they told themselves to survive the choices they made. And when you see it that way, suddenly the anger makes sense. Not excuses, not justification, but sense. They're not fighting remote work. They're fighting the possibility that their suffering meant nothing. Here is where it gets interesting, because this isn't just about individual psychology. It is about something bigger, something that happens when an entire generation shares the same wound. Psychologists call this a collective psychological defense mechanism. It is not one person protecting their ego. It is millions of people protecting a shared story, a story that holds their identity together. Think about how this shows up in conversations about remote work. Have you noticed how emotional the arguments get? How quickly they move from productivity data to words like lazy, entitled, unmotivated. Those aren't neutral observations. Those are emotional discharges. They're the language of threat. When someone says young people just don't want to work anymore, they're not describing reality. They're defending a belief. Because if young people do want to work just differently, then the whole framework collapses. There is a visual I want you to hold in your mind. Imagine someone spent 40 years building a wall, brick by brick. They mixed the mortar themselves. They worked through weekends. They bled on the stones. They missed birthdays and anniversaries and quiet evenings at home, all to build this wall. And every time they laid a brick, they told themselves, this is necessary. This is how you protect the people you love. This is what strength looks like. Now imagine someone walks up to that wall, looks at it, touches it, and says, you know, there has been a door here the whole time. You could have just walked through. The person who built the wall doesn't thank them. They don't feel relieved, they feel rage. Because if that door was always there, then what were those 40 years? What was all that sacrifice? What was the point of bleeding on stones when you could have just walked through? They're not fighting remote work. They're fighting the possibility that their suffering meant nothing. This is what makes it a collective defense mechanism. The anger isn't really about Zoom calls or productivity metrics or water cooler conversations. It is about identity. It is about meaning. It is about looking back at your life and wondering if the story you told yourself was a lie. And here is the hard part, the part we rarely talk about, that rage is human. It is understandable. It is what happens when a system you trusted, a system you suffered for, suddenly looks broken. Does this mean remote work is bad? No. Does it mean the anger is right? Also no. It means the anger is real. And real things deserve to be understood, not just dismissed. Because when you dismiss someone's defense mechanism, you don't make it go away. You make it dig deeper. You make them hold on tighter. You make them fight you. Instead of facing the grief underneath, and underneath all that anger, there is grief. Pure, quiet, unprocessed grief. Grief for the time they'll never get back. Grief for the moments they missed. Grief for the version of themselves that believed suffering was the only way. That grief doesn't excuse the judgment, but it explains it. And explanation, real, compassionate explanation, is where healing starts. So where does this leave us? If you're someone who works remotely, if you've ever been called lazy, or entitled, or told you don't understand real work, this might be hard to hear because you're not the one who built that wall. You're just the one who found the door. But here is the thing about doors. They don't threaten. The people who built walls, they reveal something. They reveal that the wall was never necessary. And that revelation, it hurts. Even if it is not your fault, it hurts the people who lived inside those walls their whole lives. So maybe we can hold two things at once. We can hold the truth that remote work is valid, productive, and here to stay. And we can hold the compassion that the generation before us is mourning something real. Not the office, not the commute, not the suits and the meetings, and the performative busyness, but the story they told themselves to survive it all. Healing isn't about proving the past was wrong. It is about allowing the future to be different. If you're from that older generation, if you're reading this and feeling that tightness in your chest, that defensiveness rising, let me say something to you directly. Those years weren't wasted. That sacrifice wasn't meaningless. You did what you thought was right with what you knew at the time. You showed up. You provided. You carried weight so your family could stand on solid ground. That matters. That will always matter. But here is the question none of us can outrun. Do we want the next generation to carry the same weight? Because if we believe suffering builds character, if we believe the struggle itself is what makes success meaningful, we have to ask ourselves, are we protecting them? Or are we protecting our own need to believe it was worth it? Every generation passes down wounds they never meant to pass down. Not out of cruelty, out of habit, out of belief, out of this is how it has always been. The gift of this moment, this strange, uncomfortable, post-pandemic moment, is that we get to choose. We get to look at the wall and the door and ask, what actually matters? Presence or performance? Hours or impact? Suffering or living? The answer isn't the same for everyone, and that is okay. But here is what I believe. The generation that built their lives around the office isn't wrong for having done it, and the generation building their lives around flexibility isn't wrong for wanting something different. The only wrong move is pretending the other side is the enemy, because underneath all the arguments, underneath the generational divide, underneath the memes and the hot takes and the LinkedIn debates, we're all just people trying to make sense of our choices. We're all just people who want to believe our time here mattered. And maybe, just maybe, the most radical thing we can do is look at each other and say, I see your sacrifice. I see your freedom, and neither of us has to be wrong for the other to be right. The future of work isn't about offices or homes. It is about finally admitting that the system we built wasn't sacred. It was just what we knew. And now we know more. What we do with that knowledge, that is the only thing that will ever really matter.